Hello and welcome to another update. In this one I'll be covering the latest developments throughout the front line, and in this one a lot has changed since the last update. We see that the Russian forces have managed to advance on the three parts of the front line, and with this we see that the Ukrainian forces have lost the initiative as they are continuously fighting here by the Zaporizhzhia direction. We see that the Ukrainian forces have not managed to advance over the past week. We see that the Ukrainian forces are stuck with the fighting by Novoprokopivka and Verbove. The latest update from Novoprokopivka was that the Ukrainian forces launched an attack towards the village, where they launched an attack with 2 tanks and 3 armored vehicles, yet they didn't manage to advance in this direction. We see that in the direction of Verbove, fighting continues here as well, but there's been no advances here either. So the Ukrainian forces continuously attack the Russian positions in the direction of Novoprokopivka and Verbove, but are unable to advance in this direction. Instead, we see that the Russian forces have managed to advance in the direction of Robotyne, where they yet again have managed to push the Ukrainian forces back from the village in the northern direction towards the river line. There's been some fighting here over the past few weeks, with the Ukrainian forces capturing, then the Russians counterattacked, then the Ukrainians counterattacked, and now the Russians have counterattacked again. And then they've managed to recapture the river line here to the north of Robotyne, with the fighting ongoing to the northwestern part. As for the central part of the Donetsk region, we see that the Russian forces managed to slightly advance in this direction. And this is a significant part of the front line, because this is a part where neither side has actually managed to advance over past 9 years. Then suddenly the Russians attacked and captured the trench here in the central part. Now it advanced slightly further in the direction of this Ukrainian trench here, as well as to the north. So we see a lot of fighting here in this direction, as the Russian forces managed to push the Ukrainian forces back from this trench here. And with that, the fighting is ongoing on the southern parts of Krasnoorivka, which is a part that has almost seen nothing but artillery fights over these 9 years. As for the Bakhmut direction, as I mentioned in the previous video, the Russian forces started attacking in the direction of Orekhovo, and here we have seen the Russian forces manage to enter and get a foothold within the village, and fighting is ongoing within it. So there's a lot of fighting here within the village of Orekhovo. There was a geolocated video which showed the Ukrainian forces being pushed away and the Russian forces getting a foothold here in the southern parts of the village. And with that, we have confirmation that the Russian forces have managed to enter it. And now we see the fighting reaching the Ukrainian positions rather than the Ukrainian advancing towards the Russian ones. And generally throughout the whole front line, we see that there is heavy artillery duels between the two sides. There's a lot of fighting on each side, mostly relying on the artillery. In the Kherson direction, there's reported to be buildups of Ukrainian troops, and these are getting heavily hit by Russian FAB-500 bombs, as well as their artillery. As for the northern parts, the Russian forces have destroyed yet another bridge across the Oskar river line. With this, the last bridge here in the northern parts are the bridge by Borova. The northern bridges by Kupiansk and Sinkove have all been destroyed in the recent weeks. With this, the Ukrainian forces are increasingly having difficulties supplying their forces on the eastern bank of the Oskar river line, and we see general Russian heavy artillery strikes and drone strikes, as well as airstrikes on the Ukrainian positions across the front line. We have also received further reports that some of the fighting taking place in Bakhmut, specifically the direction of Orekhovo, has seen an influx of Wagner soldiers side by side with VDV soldiers of the Russian army fighting in these directions. So the Russian forces and the Wagner forces are now teaming up in the direction of Bakhmut, with multiple units of Wagner forces entering the front line yet again after their months of training by Belarus. So the Wagner forces here are increasing day by day, with the recent day having 5 new units of Wagner forces arriving. These are not under the banner of Wagner, but instead under the banner of the Russian army. So they are leaving Wagner and entering the Russian army, and therefore they are forming their own units within the Russian army to then fight in the front line. and we see them used as storming units similar to the VDV soldiers. So with this, we see more infantry on the Russian side by Bakhmut, and this is to make up for the Ukrainian numerical superiority in this direction. And this is why we're starting to see the Wagner forces, or the Russian forces in general, attacking Ukrainian positions, because now the numerical difference is less than before, and it looks like with the continuous increase of Wagner forces in this direction, it may even come to the Russians having the numerical superiority in this direction, which would essentially mean the Russians would have the numerical superiority on every single part of the front line across the whole front. And to support this large number of Russian soldiers across the front, the Russians are now planning to build an extensive train network here in the southern parts. So there's no direct train connection between Russia and Mariupol. They are now going to build that. It'll connect with the current connection between Mariupol and Donetsk going through Volnovakha. So with this, there will be a train connection between Russia, Mariupol, and Donetsk. We also see that they are going to expand their train connection from Mariupol to Berdyansk and then connect it to Melitopol. So even if the Ukrainian forces manage to capture Tokmak, there will still be a train location area under the Russian control, away from direct fire from the Ukrainian forces. So this is a big infrastructure project, and if they manage to hold on to Tokmak as well, they'll essentially have doubled their amount of supplies going through by train, which will significantly improve the situation for the Russian forces. So with this, they'll be able to handle a lot more troops by the front. And at the same time, we're seeing that the Russian forces continue to recruit more forces. So with the extensive increase of Russian forces by the front line and in the rear, there is an increased possibility of a Russian offensive with this large buildup to just overpower the Ukrainian forces by sheer numbers. To add on the news about the Russian destruction of bridges by the Uska River line, we just got news and video footage of the Russian forces destroying the Uska River bridge by Kupiansk, not just the eastern part, which they've already destroyed, but also the western part now. With this, both parts of the bridge have been destroyed, so it'll delay the repairment of these bridges. So with this, we see that the Russian forces are definitely planning something here by the eastern part of the Uska River line, because they're continuously hitting the supply lines of the Ukrainian forces. With this, we see that there's a clear evidence that they are trying to weaken the Ukrainian supply lines to improve their own chances at offensive operations. If the Ukrainians are worn down and lack proper supply routes, they'll be forced to either withdraw, or they will lose their advantage to the point that the Russians will have a much easier time attacking their positions and overrunning them due to their lack of supplies. So in general, we have seen over the past few days, the Russian forces have definitely stepped up their operations, and as I predicted, the Ukrainian forces are trying to prepare for a main push, and the Russian forces are trying to prevent that main push. They started out by attacking in the Luhansk region to try and divert some of the Ukrainian forces from the southern front to the northern front. Then they started doing some other operations. They started increasing their forces elsewhere and so on. The Ukrainian forces still insist on going to the southern front. So now they are increasing their operations here in the northern parts of the front line to try and disrupt it fully by launching their own offensive or just the threat of it. With this, we see that the Ukrainian forces continuously increase their forces in the southern front, and the Russians increase their forces in the northern front, while at the same time increasing the supply lines and the effectiveness of that in the southern parts to allow more units in this part to prevent further Ukrainian superiority in this part by simply having so many soldiers here to prevent Ukrainians from planning further attacks in this direction. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.